Welcome to another episode of the Teaching Canada's History podcast. I'm your host, Brooke Campbell, and today we are speaking with the finalists of the 2024 Governor-General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. Created in 1996, the award recognizes innovative and impactful approaches to teaching Canadian history. For more information, visit canadashistory.ca/teaching award. Today I'm talking with Alma Bernier, an educator in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Thank you, Alma, for speaking with me today.
Oh, Boozhoo Aaniin, it's good to be here. It's nice to finally hear a voice and a face for all the times that we've been communicating via email.
It's so nice. I love this part of the award process. Will you share the project that you have developed for your students and maybe give us an overview of some of the main steps involved?
Well, our project started with a smaller unit, and it ended up turning into a much bigger unit. I guess in a sort of a way, the students kind of directed the direction the unit ended up going into, because we started off in September with all our different Indigenous events like Miimiiwziibiing and Orange Shirt Day, and during that time there was the election as well. So we looked at issues in contemporary Canada. And I had to take outcomes from the various grades, because I did have a 4, 5, 6, 7, because 50% of that time was English and 50% of the time was an Indigenous language, which was Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. So we ended up talking about all the things that have been happening lately, including the election when Waabibineshii Ikwe got in as the first prime minister ever for our country, Indigenous prime minister. So we started talking about that, and what our unit did is we ended up taking a walk back into time. So we looked at everything that happened in September, October, and then we walked backwards and we said, okay, well, why is everybody so excited? Like they were kind of looking at it, and it was the first time they ever were really interested in the politics of anything around them, which was really exciting. And so we did a walk backwards in time, and that was basically how we did our entire unit, all the way back to pre-contact, which pulled in a whole lot of outcomes from the different grade levels and the different units that you could do, which made it really amazing, because then we started following the UDL model that was developed by Jennifer Cates. And so we went back and we looked at all the things that were in direct relation to why it was such a wonderful time that he got elected. And we looked at all the issues of why Miimiiwziibiing was there. So we went into a kind of like a 5W thing. And then they started doing all the research, and we started looking at different websites, and we started looking at different numbers. And then at one point, when we were sitting doing our inquiry, I had asked students, because we started getting into a deep discussion about the missing and murdered of North America, of Turtle Island. And I had simply asked a question of, does anybody know of anyone who has gone missing or has been, murdered? Or the part that really struck me and made me want for them to really understand about everything that's happening around them during their time. And it made me really want them to understand everything in their lives that has happened to their families as well. So I asked that specific question, and then 3/4 of the classroom had their hands in the air. So 3/4 of the classroom of the children knew someone who was missing, knew someone in their family who had been murdered. They had aunties, they had grandmothers, and they had extended family people and stuff, and friends that their grandmas and their mothers had. So it was really, really eye-opening to see that stuff have impacted them that much, at such a younger age. And I thought, well, you know what? I don't know how much we're actually doing for our curriculums anywhere to actually bring light to all the issues that are happening in our own country, our own backyard, our own homes, and our students, our children need to learn the history. So then we started our history walk, and we walked back into time, and we looked at different issues and why these issues. And then we got to residential school, and we kept going back and we talked about that. And I myself had gone to residential school as well. So I gave them a little snippet of what I knew as well. And I actually had 4 elders come in as well, and they talked about their experiences and stuff. It was really a wonderful, wonderful, like just an amazing unit that we did. And we went and we went all the way back to a pre-contact era, and we talked about how we had a government, how we, as a Anishinaabe people, had our own kind of currency with trade, how we had our ways of traveling and our ways of communicating with each other, and how families were, like the dynamics of the families and the clan systems. So we started getting into the clan systems. And the clan system is basically a whole form of governance. And it also was a piece that guided people where, like they knew whose clan was who, where they lived. So it was kind of mapping out a whole lot of stuff as well visually. And as we moved back, we started talking about how the treaties came into play. So that was another one that kind of linked to that. So every little unit we made into just an ginormous unit, and it made its own links to everything. And it was so great that the kids, we had a map of Manitoba. I'm still seeing if they have one for Ontario and Saskatchewan, but in the map of Manitoba that I got from MF NERC, it has all the names in the Indigenous languages, the Dene, the Cree, the Dakotas, the Ojibwe's, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. And the kids started identifying which First Nation they're from. So once we started doing that, we started folding in the language. We started folding in the language, and we started doing our sharing circle. And in that sharing circle, they were able to start identifying who they were by saying if they were like Anishinaabe, mahkwa, Ikwe. So that means I'm an Indigenous Aboriginal female teacher and woman. And then if they had their spirit names, which was something they started getting into, is finding out if they had their spirit names, and they started bringing them in. And then they had to identify their plans along with which First Nation they're directly related to, so where their families came from. Because at first they didn't understand, where are you from? And I would say Miimiiwziibiing, which is Berens River, Manitoba. But I live in Winnipeg. So, and the kids they had this false sense of, oh, where are you from? And they'd all just say Winnipeg, every single one of them. So then after the unit 2, that they learned which First Nation they're from, which was really nice. So now as we do our sharing circle, they start sharing all those little pieces. So we decided to put Winnipeg in dizhinikaaz, which means I'm from Winnipeg. So then they started looking at what does Winnipeg mean, because then they saw all their First Nation communities in the language. So we started looking at all these other places, these cities and stuff, and we started looking at that. The kids also were able to see who was from where, and there was quite a few of them there were little blocks on the map where there was quite 2 or 3 of them that were from the same place. So they were all interested, which got them talking about their own friends and relatives in each of those places. So it really engaged the students like 110%, 200%, I would say, in the whole unit. So we kept going. We talked about trade and gift giving and all the treaties. So it was such a wonderful thing. When I sent in my examples of pictures. It was so hard to pick because I had so many of them and the kids were so engaged completely the whole time. So basically, the unit took about 2 months. It ended up being about 2 months. And it was such a wonderful start to the year so that they started doing social, the grade sevens that I had started doing social studies in the other classrooms, and they had that background information when they started doing their units, and they had that extra insight, which was such an awesome thing, because I know one of the other teachers had mentioned something to me and I said, yeah, we went through all that. And the kids knew by the end of the unit, they knew the reasons why we had MMIW. They knew all the negative impacts on Indigenous people, and they knew about abuses, and they knew about, and we even did a sock drive at one point. We did, but this was last year, but I mean, we talked about it this year about our homeless, right? And we talked about the homeless and sometimes why are they there? Like sometimes it's not a choice, or sometimes, maybe the older ones that were there have gone to residential schools, and we talked about all the effects, right? So then it gave them, again, another empathetic view on people around the areas that they live in and stuff. It was wonderful. I just loved it. I'd do it again.
Yeah, it's a very personal project for you, for your students, and I think it's so great that you started with talking about current events and issues, and then going backwards in time to give that understanding and to help guide that inquiry that you described. Can you tell me more about how your students were then able to deepen and strengthen their historical thinking through all of this?
Well, the one thing that I remember is a couple of the students were talking, and they're, unfortunately, one of them had met up with somebody who had a different view, and so this particular student decided to, I guess, school them on how the history line went and what happened and why things are the way they are. So, and that made me like, I had to run to the principal. I was telling them this and that, and it was so amazing. And the fact that the kids are not angry about it, right? You would think, like, if, I mean, you go to the adults, and of course, kids are so resilient. You teach an adult this new stuff, and then, that anger comes up. But with the kids, it came out in such a way that now they're these new little advocates we have, and they do it with a great sense of belonging and identity now, and that makes all the difference. So if anybody was to bring up a conversation on any of the stuff that they've gone through, they're confident in walking into those conversations. And they have been talking about stuff in and amongst themselves as well, right? Which made it concrete in my mind that, wow, they did get it. Like, we did it. We really did it. Like, they're starting to think in a historical aspect, and able to bring all that information in to a contemporary place that we all live now. It was wonderful. It was so great. And it's so nice that, they can walk out, and if they see they said, even after we started talking about the homeless, they were walking, and they were, they'd see them, they'd say, oh, every time I seen them, I give them a coffee or a sandwich, or so there was a lot that we're doing that now. So it was giving them that almost a social justice kind of lens to look through now, which is really good. And like I said, in our country, we need to start doing that more for our kids, all kids, not just one group of kids. We need to start teaching everybody who they are, where they came from, and the history behind who they are. And once we do that, can you imagine what kind of country that we'd have for future leaders? And we did, and then some of the kids did say, I'm going to be prime minister, I'm going to be the principal of this school. And it wasn't just any jobs. They were choosing jobs of leadership. And that changed their thinking. And it made me so proud.
That's exactly what I was just going to say was you must be so proud. These are incredible stories and anecdotes that you're sharing. What resources do you go to or rely on then when in your classroom and when you're talking about history and supporting your students' learning?
Well, our first resource is always the elders, right? So, and with respect to them, we always take their stories and they listen and they get to ask questions. So that's their first kind of interactive piece of resource that we use. And then we go into the films. I do have the Seven Fires DVDs, and I know using DVDs now is not. It's hard to find a DVD player in a school these days because everything is so digital. But we do have those Seven Fires DVDs. We listen to them, we pull them out in the order that we were doing it, not in an order that it was there. So we use those, and they were great. And I mean, I always say the older the resource, truer it is, because as things start being added these days, things are a little bit changed. It's through that what do they say, when something's told, it'll be told in another way the next time. And it's like the game we play in school, telephone, right? You start off with one thing and you end up with another thing. But basically we used the older the resources, the better for us to understand. And we did have an elder too, Peter Atkinson, who talks about the clan systems as well. So we used a lot of the elders for our stuff. We used the DVD films and some websites we got about certain people that we were looking at. So, say for Wab Kinew, we Googled him. So we used Google a lot to Google people who were out in their contemporary time, and we looked at information, right? And then we also went to government websites as well. And the kids were the thing about the websites too. And we were talking about the whole thing when we were looking at resources, is that how do you know a website is true? Like, how can you trust a website? So we were combing through everything, and the kids were actually looking at everything. And now they're the way they go onto the webs now is that they go, oh well, is this information actually true? Who's editing this web page? When was it last updated? And all those little details. So it was nice to see them starting to do that. I mean, as adults, we rarely do that anymore because we're living in such a fast world. We don't even look back to check those little things, right? So all those resources we did. We read books. There was a book on Tom Belanger, An Indian Remembers, it's called. And he had a memoir that was typed out into a book and published. And we read all his stories. And this was in his first words, right? And first person. So we read the whole thing of how they used to travel, how they used to camp, where they would stop, what they would do, how far they'd go, and by foot or dog team. And it talked about people in those areas. So, and the ones that he talked about, I knew as well as a teacher, so I can confirm that all those details were true as well. So we did our best to find what we could to help us in what we did. The one thing I did not do is I didn't go into the textbooks. My idea with that was we grew up with the textbooks, and in the textbooks they didn't have the 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 other point of view in them. So I kept those aside, and I we learned the point of view that was never taught to anybody. So, and it was really interesting, and the kids just loved it, like I said.
You've already touched on the importance of this work, but can you share a little bit more about the impact that you've seen it's had on your students and on the community?
When we did all our sharing, they made wampum belts too as well, because we had one of our cultural advisors, Jason Parento, come in, and he brought in a wampum belt from Roseau River First Nation. And we were talking about wampum belts, and we Googled the different wampum belts and what each wampum belt meant. So the students decided to make their own wampum belts. And they decided what did their wampum belt really stand for? What did it mean? Who are they gifting it to, right? Or is it a wampum belt for their family? So each of the different students were coming up with their own ideas. And all those ideas, I could see the whole unit coming out onto these wampum belts. It was so amazing. I think I did send in some pictures of those wampum belts at that time too. Yeah. So some of them were talking about, oh, this one is for my football team. There was one there that said rods, and then there was others that said there was two people on it, and that's for me and my family. And then there was another one that did a river and some flowers, and they said that was for their home community. So everything that they did with the wampum belts kind of solidified the idea for me that the kids had done a lot of learning, and they took in that learning, and now they're able to show me what they've learned. And that, that impact just on them alone just is something that, now they can carry forward. And imagine the conversations and the work that's going to come out of these particular students that we went through this project, what kind of answers and what kind of outcomes they're going to have in their future years in, involving social studies, even science and ELA. And like the impact was so great. Like the students loved it, the parents loved it. They were so proud that their children know where they came from. They know they live in Winnipeg, but they're not from Winnipeg. They know that they have a family clan. They know their names if they have a spirit name. And a lot of the parents are starting to ask if their children can get their spirit names. So next year we do have a project starting where we're going to bring elders in or send the parents out to go for ceremonial naming. And it's good too. And the kids now know their identities, right? And they know the language, because the language and identity, who we are, the culture and the language go together hand in hand. You can't walk a path without separating them. And during that whole unit, they were learning all these words. They were learning the word for treaty. They were learning words for gift giving. They were learning words for their grandparents, their great grandparents, their parents, like everything. So we threw in the language as much as we could, and it was very repetitive. So they remembered a lot. And then at one point, they did do classroom treaties as well. And they decided, they actually had treaties they started at the beginning. Then they revised their treaty and they changed it. And they compared it to how nowadays people are going back and looking at the treaty rights, and they're trying to change some things that were put in there. And that was just the greatest thing ever for them to even do that. I mean, their minds work in ways that sometimes we lose that child thought, that playfulness, that wondering, right? Because they have that. They always have. It was such an amazing long unit. And to make them in these huge chunks, these huge amounts, actually makes such a big difference. And that's what you learn through that UDL too, is that they're not little units. You combine all these outcomes and you make this one enormous unit. And it worked so well for all the different levels that I had in my classroom from 4 to 7. Oh, and the one thing I told the students about our whole unit, I sat there and I said, do you realize that in our classroom today and yesterday and the day before and that, and when we first started, I said, do you realize that you guys are getting a university level education on Indigenous issues and history here today? And it's true. And they sat there and they were in such awe that they were so proud of themselves. And they were just beaming and they were smiling and they thought that was just the greatest. And I said, it's true. It's true. You should give yourselves a pat on the back.
Yeah, I can only imagine the ripple effects of, like, you think about one individual student, let alone a whole classroom, but one individual student and what they've learned and how that's gonna
Yeah.
go and further, you know, the conversations that they have in their lives, as you've already shared. It's just so beautiful.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alma, for sharing more about this important work and telling us more about your students in your classroom.
Oh, no problem. I'm glad to do it. I'm glad to share. I always say, even with the language and everything else, it's our duty to share everything, right? And like the language too, it's not just one person's to keep. It's for you to share, and that was the gift that the Creator gave us, as well as all our knowledge and stuff too. So I shared that with the kids, sharing it with you, and hopefully that others can follow suit as well, because it does make a ginormous difference, huge difference.
Thank you.
Miigwech.